Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, who would have thought that only 10 years after Katrina, we would hear talk about flood insurance rates going down in some areas and a deal for an entertainment complex along the lakefront. Both happened in the same week. Elsewhere, there were new rules for public housing, more controversy on the monuments issue, investigations of both the Orleans criminal clerks and the sheriff's office, and a plan to develop a riverfront soccer complex at the Fly has apparently taken wing. In the buzz for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. David Hammer, investigative reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4. Jessica Williams, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. And Jeff Adelson, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. We go over to David first to talk about the latest development this week about the proposed soccer complex at The Fly, that spot along the river behind Audubon Park. It is no more.
Right, it appears to be dead, and this is a real testament to public action and public input. This was something where citizens in the area got upset that there was going to be a $4 million soccer complex with, you know, structures and buildings and a artificial turf field placed on an area that now has trees and a little bit of rolling hills and a art installation and a playground. Now the plan was going to replace the playground and update the structures that are already there, and there was going to be some public benefit there, but the feeling was this is green space, this is a public park, and this would be inuring to the benefit of private entities. The Carrollton Booster Club, which is a private nonprofit youth soccer organization, was going to get control of that. And it was a philanthropist and local Caesars executive named John Payne who raised the money, got donations from Drew Brees and Tom Benson and others to try to build the complex. But the people didn't want it. When they started raising questions, we started raising questions. And the other thing that was interesting about it was that it showed the pitfalls of public-private partnerships. The Audubon Commission and the Audubon Institute, and questions about what role Ron Foreman as the head essentially of both of those agencies played. And in the end, the public's outcry did have the biggest impact, but in the end it really was another nonprofit entity that may have played a bigger role in scuttling the deal, and that is the Louisiana Fire Youth Soccer Club, because they actually controlled the already cleared grass fields in the back, because there was a negotiation process to try to move the complex to maybe come up with a compromise, and they couldn't make that compromise happen without support from Louisiana Fire, and that kind of fell apart. And John Payne decided, you know what, it's not worth moving forward. This should be a win for everybody, and I think it's time to pull the plug.
We should point out that the Carrollton Boosters Club has been a positive force in this community. This isn't some sort of like evil organization right here.
Right, absolutely. And nobody was going to gain any kind of personal financial benefit on the Carrollton Boosters. But some of the questions that I raised was about some of the people who were on both boards, both the giving and receiving board, and particularly there was two members of the Audubon board who had a beverage. There was a beverage contract. Exclusive beverage rights written into the contract for the new soccer complex, and two members of the Audubon board were owners and directors of those companies. So there's a question about whether they were personally benefiting. They said that they didn't know that that was even included, but it raised questions about who's driving the ship here with public land, what's ultimately public land.
So the criticism for it was, number one, also there was just not enough public input. People were surprised by this whole complex, even though they recognized that perhaps the intent was really very good to give better soccer facilities to all of the young soccer players out there.
Right, exactly. I mean, this was an agreement that was approved but not yet signed, but it was approved almost a year ago now, April of 2015, and very little notice was given, was one of the complaints. There was also this complaint that the city council, as our elected officials, should be more involved in a decision that's dealing with city land and private entities.
So is there any talk or any thought of maybe going back to the drawing board and seeing if something can be worked out? I know that there were attempts to negotiate a compromise, and then Mr. Payne this week said, and very sadly said, no, we're just not going to go through with this.
He says he's giving the money back to the people who donated it, and his plan is apparently dead. But there are more things that need to be worked out. The Louisiana Fire still has control of those grass fields for another year and a half, and people have to figure out how this property is going to be used. And there's also Carrollton Boosters has the baseball fields that are there right now. So there's a lot of questions that I think are, people are starting to look at how these agreements came into place in the first place.
Okay, thanks a lot, David. Moving over to Jessica now, and there have been some rule changes regarding public housing and convicted felons.
Yes, and I think it's important to note that this is the culmination of something that's been in the works for really almost 4 years. The Housing Authority of New Orleans, when it was under federal management, set out to create a policy that would ensure that convicted offenders who are released from jail would have the opportunity to reunite with their families in public housing. These are typically individuals who face discrimination, advocates say, in the housing market, typically individuals whose relatives are already in public housing. So keeping them out, which was what the old policy did, kind of isolates them from their families, allows them to go into situations where they're paying much more than they can afford for housing. So the policy that was passed this week was an attempt to rectify that. And what it set out to do was essentially give, instead of completely barring them based on whatever red flag would come up on their criminal background check, it's saying that we're going to give them an individualized review. We're going to look at how long it's been since they've committed the crime. We're going to look at the nature of the crime, what it is. Obviously, things like homicides, kidnappings would warrant more scrutiny than simple petty theft. So the Housing Authority, moving forward, they took those advocates' recommendations into consideration and have decided to give what's seen as more of a fair shake for these folks as they move to try to reunite with their families.
So are the advocates satisfied with these changes?
It seemed as though they were in the beginning. They did win a really big concession. One of the key things to know about Hando's housing stock post-Katrina, whereas before we had the massive public housing projects, now most things are controlled by private entities. The mixed developments that have popped up around town, like Columbia Park, Harmony Oaks, that you see that are now managed by these private developers such as HRI, such as Columbia Residential. And those managers really handle their own affairs when it comes down to criminal background checks, when it comes down to policy screenings. And essentially what this new policy does is say, we're going to strongly encourage that you follow this one rubric that we've set out. We're going to strongly encourage that you do this. And the advocates had at first said that, well, encouragement is not enough. We need more of a mandate. So what Hano did was change their policy to say that unless you can prove that legally you do not have to comply, we expect you to comply.
Just you drive along those new housing developments, and they look very nice. They look like pleasant neighborhoods. And what do you hear? Are they working?
It seems, from folks that are currently advocating for more affordable housing in the city, it seems as though there's not enough of them. So people say that, now as the housing stock continues, affordable housing stock continues to dwindle, we need even more properties. We saw the Section 8 list open up last week and the public housing list for the new Florida. Thousands of applicants applied for a very limited number of spaces. So moving forward, there's an advocacy group called Housing NOLA that is going to try to work with the city to develop 5,000 more housing opportunities within the next 5 years or so. That's still not enough. They're saying that we need about 30,000 to really get everyone on the same level where they were. But it seems to me as though the advocates that have advocated pushing for this now are saying that, yes, what we've got now is great, but we need more of it. It's nice. It looks a lot better, of course, than some of the older housing projects did. But we need more of it. We don't have enough to help support all of the families that need it.
It seems like there's a real push now for helping people who come out of the prison system, there's a recognition all of a sudden that recidivism is caused when you make it difficult for people who are trying to come out of jail to, become members of society again. And this seems to address that.
Yeah, that's exactly what the housing advocates had pushed for and exactly what HANO sets out to do. If you give someone affordable housing, you ensure that they have a job, they'll be less likely to get back into the life of crime that pushed them in that situation.
Back to the private operators of these developments, they are going to be given an option there whether or not they're being urged to follow this new policy. Have we heard from them what they intend to do with it?
They've actually been keeping their thoughts and opinions about this pretty close to the chest. At their most recent board meeting on Monday, the board president of HANO actually said, well, we need to pass a policy, number one, so that they can tell us whether or not they agree with it or not. Because before this, even though we've had months of public discussion on this, there's been numerous workshops, we haven't heard anything publicly from the developers that this really affects. The representative from HRI, former Mayor Sidney Bartholomew, was at the meeting on Monday when this was passed and essentially said that his group hadn't had a chance to even read the policy.
Yeah. So we don't know yet what their stand is.
We don't know.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jessica. Over to Jeff now. Monuments. There was some action in this past week, and basically it leads to no action.
That's a very good way of putting it. The first thing that happened was last Friday. The Fifth Circuit came in with a ruling that basically said that this is the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, federal court,
yes.
Saying that the district court, the city cannot take down the monuments until the case moves through the district court. That's overruling the district court's ruling, which said, which really found no reason to block the city from the removal while the case goes on. So that was a victory for those who support keeping the monuments, and I'm sure
challenging the constitutionality of what was passed by the council.
Yeah, they're challenging it on constitutional and some legal rulings. And I think the pro-monument people are hoping that case is going to result in obviously an opinion that the monuments can't come down. That case, though, isn't supposed to be settled until probably sometime this summer.
So the monuments stay at least until this case proceeds through the courts and is, reaches its final judgment or verdict or whatever. Now let's get back to another issue. Then this is in the state regarding the monuments. There's legislation that is being proposed in the state that has something to do with not just our monuments, but the consideration of monuments around the state.
There's a piece of legislation by Senator Mizell, she's a new senator, that would create a commission essentially to oversee any discussion about removing a wide swath of historic monuments. The legislation was supposed to go before a committee earlier in this week, ended up getting delayed because Mizell said she needed a little more time to prepare her arguments.
That's Mizell? Is that who it is?
That's correct, yeah. And at the same time, there's now another bill that's been filed in the House that has a very similar goal. And while these established commissions, the sort of underlying argument is that, these commissions would likely block what the city is trying to do here.
With the talking now about Andrew Jackson and throwing him in the mix, have you heard from any of the people who want to take the monuments down who might be like, this is hurting our cause, to throw more into the mix that, Andrew Jackson being the hero of the Battle of New Orleans starts to maybe undermine their argument on the others?
Well, and that's an interesting situation that's going on right now, because yesterday the city council, a committee of the city council heard that an argument to take Jackson down, but the argument was being made for exactly that point. The Tulane University administrator named Richard Marksberry was the one who was making the arguments about Jackson, but his point, he doesn't want Jackson to come down. He doesn't want any of the monuments that are under discussion to come down. He was there to make the point that if the council's being consistent about the way it applies these standards, about how it views monuments, Jackson's going to come down. And his argument, or the end point of that argument, I think, is that he's going on the assumption that the council doesn't want to take it down, the public doesn't want to take Jackson down, and is hoping to show that that you shouldn't take any statues down because of that.
So basically the issue is before us and will continue to be, and no action is going to be taken on the monuments certainly before this federal case is considered and resolved.
No time soon, although the city hasn't said exactly what its response to that ruling is going to be yet.
Okay. All right. Now let's move on over now to Sheriff's Office and Clerk's Office in the City of New Orleans. Sheriff's Office, Orleans Sheriff's Office, Chief Deputy, perhaps embroiled in a scandal here?
Yeah, well, I mean, our sources are telling us that he is the unnamed co-conspirator, employee A, in a bill of information that came down last week against a former colonel in that sheriff's office, Roy Austin, who was essentially using ghost employees to run details at major events, including Super Bowl 47, the Voodoo Fest, and various Mardi Gras crews over several years. Basically, charging these private events for security details, but charging more than just the people who were providing the details, but fake employees who didn't really work those details. And he was, according to the bill of information that came out last week, this employee A gave him the power to do that, gave him the ability to do it, and used his and his family members to allow him to cash checks that they were able to use for their benefit. And our sources tell us that that employee A is in fact the number 2 man in Sheriff Guzman's office, which is Jerry Urson.
And once again, it's the details that raises its ugly head and causes trouble.
Right. I mean, the federal consent decree for NOPD called it the aorta of corruption. Well, Jerry Urson was a top guy at the NOPD when that was the case. He moves over to the sheriff's office, and guess what? It looks like the aorta of corruption is just beating the heart at the sheriff's office instead of at the NOPD.
All right, and let's talk now about the clerk of court's office, and Arthur Morrell. He came under fire from the state legislative auditor.
Yeah, he did come under fire on Monday in a pretty scathing audit. Probably the biggest headline out of that audit is that over the last several years, the office has paid about $58,000 for a variety of parties and gifts and things like that for employees. This is all coming at a time when Arthur Morrell and Mayor Mitch Landrieu's administration have been fighting over what Morrell's budget should be, because the city provides the funds for Morrell's budget. Morrell has argued they can't control the spending though, or how much he has to spend. So the Landrieu administration has certainly been looking to this audit, which also identified some problems with how credit cards were being used and how much people are being paid for election work, and saying, look, this is why we need more control over this office.
But the clerk of court, Arthur Morrell, has been saying, I need more money for this operation. I've lost staff, et cetera. But then this money was spent for, and he justifies spending the money because of staff morale, because they just aren't working with some of the stuff that they need.
Well, staff morale, and in some of the arguments he's made, he's actually explicitly said he held some of these events to push back against the city's arguments against them and use them as, he would call it, an educational opportunity for the public. But
now he has paid back some expenses, personal expenses that he put on an office credit card.
That's correct. He's reimbursed the office for that.
Okay.
And there's no real allegations in the audit of anyone pocketing any money or things like that.
Okay.
Meanwhile, his son, J.P. Morrell, is a state senator, is regarded as one of the real promising political figures for the future.
Indeed,
definitely.
He is. Yeah, he's very active in the legislature, that's for sure. Okay, we're going to stick with Jeff right now and talk about flood insurance. Now, the new flood maps have come out for Orleans, and there were new maps for Jefferson maybe about 5 or 6 weeks ago.
Those are still in the works,
okay.
Yeah.
But it's looking like maybe lower rates?
Yeah, it's good news for most of New Orleans. A pretty large swath of the city is going to see properties moved into more favorable flood zones. And this is all really going to take effect sometime this summer. City officials say probably around June, when the city itself adopts those new flood maps. But a lot of properties are being moved from special hazard areas into areas that are with lower probability of flooding, in part due to the new upgraded levee system system we've got, the better pumps that are being installed, and other changes. And this has been a 3-year fight between the city and FEMA, which oversees the flood map program. And the city's raised issues with the kind of mapping that FEMA was doing, the way that they were making some calculations. So this is pretty good news for most New Orleans residents.
For most, but not all.
Not all. Lower Coast Algiers is getting moved into a higher risk category. That's the main concentration of people that are going to see an increase in their insurance as opposed to a decrease.
And why is that? Just because of the topography there, or outside of levee protection? Or?
We haven't gotten a really great sense of exactly what's happening there. It does seem to have a lot to do with topography and the amount of protection that's in that area.
And if you have any questions about it, if you're in Orleans Parish and wonder where you stand, you guys had a good map graphic that you can find at your website, right?
Yeah, at the NewOrleansAdvocate.com. We've got a map. We're working on some that might show a little more detail, and FEMA has maps where you can plug in your address and see what the effects are.
But the bottom line is, even if you are been moved to a zone that's not as prone to flooding, like an X zone, they still say get flood insurance.
Absolutely. You should have flood insurance regardless, and officials have been hammering that message home, whether it's required or not, because you never know what's going to happen.
And the Jefferson maps are not finished yet. They're not.
Jefferson maps are still working their way through the process.
Still a work in progress. Okay. All righty. Thanks a lot, Jeff. Well, Errol, our lakeshore around the lakefront airport area. Before the storm, there was Bally's Casino there and stuff going on. Since the storm, nothing.
But in the whole history of New Orleans, there's never been that much along the lakeshore. I mean, when you look at what a resource that is, all the miles and miles, I mean, all the possibility, and people say, well, how about green space and beach space? There's still plenty of room for both, and still doing more with development. That little spot where the airport is, and people might remember the Bally's Casino, for a while had a bit of activity. The casino didn't work. One day when people look back at this time in New Orleans history, there's going to be a man named Roland von Kornikowski, who's one of the really important figures in New Orleans this day. This is the guy who runs Tipitinas, but he also on his own redeveloped the Orpheum, he and his wife. They didn't have big government grants, they just did it.
It's such a beautiful job, too, down there.
Beautiful job. And his wife and daughter even did the painting, they did the gold leaf, and it's just an incredible couple. But now he wants to develop that area, make it an entertainment area with a lot of different options. They filed a plan with the city this week, and if this happens, this is going to be something that's could finally bring some life to that part of the city. And I know you've been following it. Do you have any?
Yeah, he is planning to put a music club, a recording studio. The development team that leases the property that application's been put in. They've got that lease. They're looking to get permits for all of the designs that he wants to put there, an outdoor amphitheater, an open air market, really to breathe some sort of life into that area that's been vacant for so long before Katrina, and just really trying to bring that area back. He's looking to spend about $13 million to do so over the next 5 years. He's got an architect to do so. And for all intensive purposes, just hoping to really try to attract more commerce in that area.
How do they deal with the fact that it's outside the flood protection? I mean, every time there's a storm, even minor storms, you have flooding at the lakefront airport, and people and their businesses in there. There are some businesses there. Obviously, they had to redo that historic airport terminal. What do they do to protect against that?
I'm not sure that was detailed in the plans that they've submitted. I'm sure it's something that they're thinking about for sure. But casinos in general are built on, floating, mostly the ones that are down here are built in that sort of floating atmosphere, that floating environment. So I'm sure it's something that he's thinking about now, and hopefully he'll maybe get a little bit of a discount with some of these new people. Perhaps is that area in the same...
if you're outside the flood protection, so you're not
on your own.
I think what did in the old airport wasn't as much the flood, it was just age, and there wasn't just a good plan for it. It was used for for private airline service. They never allowed commercial airline service in there. And at one time, Southwest actually wanted to go in there, and that would have just picked up the whole area right there. But if you just look at that whole area right there, you know, from the University of New Orleans, that whole segment, it's dragging. It's dragging economically. It's dragging residentially. I mean, it really needs some energy. I mean, it's a big chunk of town right there that has an enormous potential and an enormous lakefront, and maybe this is the first step towards doing something.
Well, and it's worth noting that in terms of development on the lakefront, there's also the Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation's plan to bring back Pontchartrain Beach, which they're currently involved in a fundraising effort to truck quite a bit of sand. I think it's about 17,000 tons of sand out to the beach with the effort of reopening it. Probably not this year, but next year as a real public amenity.
And bringing back a small amusement park, which is what Pontchartrain Beach was, they're having some rides. You know, it could be a good thing.
So far, no rides planned.
Yeah,
The Zephyr's not coming back.
So make it into a recreation area. Yeah. And there's still plenty of room to do things out there, and it just hasn't happened.
So these plans, it's called Lakeshore Landing, right?
Lakeshore Landing is
So
the name of the
when would he
project.
get started on this, do you think? When would phase one begin?
He's looking to get started relatively soon as he can get the permits and everything situated. And, you know, as we mentioned, outdoor amphitheater, open air markets, really bringing breathing some life into an area that's been shuttered for a very long time.
And this would be done in different phases over a period
Three
of
phases.
about 5 years.
Of about 5 years,
And giving
yes.
us a chance to go enjoy our lakefront even more.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Jessica. It's time to look ahead. Errol.
Well, now that I'm hot on this topic. Okay, this has always been Errol's plan, that the real objective of the tricentennial should be the lakefront. If you remember, you know, we did the riverfront for the World's Fair, but why don't we put a lot of attention on the lakefront, including having some sort of a tower or a monument or some kind of beacon doing that, and really making our lakefront a showplace and a place for recreation and leisure.
You need to give Roland a call.
Okay.
David.
Well, there was a big decision a couple of weeks ago in the BP case where the judge determined that the moratorium claims, people who lost because the government shut down drilling afterwards, are not going, that BP's not liable for them. And that's a big blow to thousands of claimants who were left out of the process up till now. And so I'm going to take a look at some of those details.
All right, we'll be looking for that. Jessica.
Just to talk a little bit about what's going on in the legislature and how it affects New Orleans, we're expecting to see some of the education bills, related bills being heard in committee over the next couple weeks. A few bills that would divert more funding back to the Orleans Parish School Board that would make it a little bit difficult for charter schools to open up in the area. So we'll be keeping a lookout on that.
Okay, Jessica, thanks. Jeff.
Also, in terms of the legislature, two bills made it out of a Senate committee yesterday, one that would raise the minimum wage and one that requires equal pay. Those are both sponsored by New Orleans Democrats, J.P. Morrell and Karen Carter Peterson. And it'll be interesting to see how those make it through the process going forward. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, you guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us. And we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.